So Alvaro has disappeared. But anyway, good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this introductory meeting on social protection and public finance management. So this is a meeting jointly organized by ILO and UNICEF, as you may have heard earlier in the previous sessions. And for this, or for the session today, we are happy to have Anthony Hodges with us, who will be discussing during the first session on PFM and budgeting to improve social protection. And in the second session, we are going to have a case study on the same topic, right? Analyzing budgets for a specific social protection budgets for a specific country. So Anthony has long experience working as a social policy specialist and even regional advisor for UNICEF. In Africa, he has experience in different continents and different contexts, and he's part of those delivering the UNICEF Public Finance for Children global course with Oxford Policy Management. So the model today is delivered jointly by the Program Management Unit, but also in collaboration with Oxford Policy Management. So I'm now giving the floor to Tony to start the presentation right away instead of using time that would be useful for us to understand the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aristide, and I'm very grateful for you for controlling the slides. I'm very happy to be here, and I think we can just go straight into move on to the first slide, Aristide.
Totally sorry. Just before we start, I am hearing some background noise from some participants. So if I may ask all participants to kindly mute your mic if you're not speaking, I think that will help. Thank you. And go ahead, Tony.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alvaro. So what we're going to cover today are three things, really. First, why public financial management matters for social protection. Secondly, I'm then going to present some, key features of PFM for social protection, things that basically it would be good for social protection experts to know about the public financial management system and the budget. And then the last part is going to be about costing social transfers, and I'm also going to introduce the concept of cost efficiency. In the other module that I'm going to be doing later on in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be looking at cost effectiveness and equity in social protection financing. Okay, but let's start off then with why PFM matters for social protection. We can move on. Well, the basic point here is simply that much of social protection is financed through the budget. There's an exception here, obviously, in the sense that contributory programs in the private sector are financed mainly by or entirely by contributions from employers and employees. But apart from that, really all of the rest of social protection is financed through the budget. So on the left-hand side there, we have social transfers. And social transfers are, they're wide-ranging in their type. This includes things like social old age pensions. It includes things like child grants that are provided by the state. It includes, we're going to go through these different bubbles one by one. So there's a whole range of social transfers there. These are non-contributory social protection programs that are financed from public resources. Then I've put there in green the social services or social work is the kind of social protection that's provided by social workers. It's not in the form of transfers, but in the form of services to address, risks, social risks such as violence and abuse and so forth. Those services, again, are public services provided by the state and financed through the budget. There are then also the government employees' social security schemes. although those are contributory, and the state employees may make also their own contributions, the government as an employer also has to make its contributions to those schemes. In blue there, we have another type of financing from the budget to contributory schemes where they need to be subsidized by the government. And I've mentioned there in particular national health insurance schemes, because often governments will subsidize a national health insurance scheme in order to make it affordable, in order to provide possibilities for exemptions for premiums, for example, for the poor, or simply to reduce the size of premiums that people in general need to pay. So there can be, and very often are, government subsidies to national health insurance schemes. Finally, on the right-hand side, I've also included price subsidies. Some people might not consider them to be really a form of social protection, but often, price subsidies on things like food and fuel are introduced by or maintained by governments for social protection purposes. I mean, we could maybe argue, and often do argue, that they're not a particularly efficient or equitable form of social protection, but the rationale for them is often given in social protection terms. And they, of course, are financed also through the budget, and in many countries can actually be very substantial as a percentage of total government expenditure. So all of these different dimensions of social protection are financed through the budget, and that means, therefore, that for effective and equitable social protection, it's extremely important that we understand how these different types of schemes are financed with public resources through government budgets. Aristide? I thought it was also interesting just to show scale of public social protection expenditure. Point again that understanding budgets is incredibly important, because the amount that governments spend on social protection can be very considerable, but it also varies enormously by regions and within regions. You can see here data from the ILO's World Social Protection Report. I think it's the last edition for 2017 to 2019. But you can see, in Europe and Central Asia, for example, that 16.5% of gross domestic product goes on public social protection expenditure. I mean, total budgets in Europe and Central Asia, I'm not sure exactly what level they are, but they're probably in the range around about 40% of GDP. Some people, or one or two people, have got their mics on. Can you please mute them? Yeah, thank you. But as you can see, there is a huge difference between regions. If we take Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's only about 4.5% of GDP, which goes on public social protection expenditure, compared to, say, 9.7% in Latin America and the Caribbean, or 7.4% in Asia and the Pacific. The graphic on the right-hand side shows how much this level of expenditure varies even within regions. And here we've got Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that there are some countries there that are spending, less than 1% of GDP on public expenditure on social protection. But there are, other countries at the other end of the spectrum where it's much, much higher. Mauritius is the leader there with 7.4%. Next slide, please, Aristide. Next slide, yeah. I think it's good to understand public expenditure as being a key stage in the results chain that goes from social protection policy to impacts. And you can see that here. Social protection policies and strategies, they feed into the budget allocations, or in theory they should do. The budget allocations are transformed into actual expenditure to a greater or lesser extent. And that expenditure, finances the production of the social protection outputs, which are numbers of people receiving social protection benefits, or the value of the social protection benefits that they receive. And finally, those social protection outputs contribute to desired social outcomes and impacts, such as the reduction of poverty, or compensating for the loss of income in old age, or whatever. So we can see public expenditure as a key part in that results chain, going from policy to impacts. Let's move on. Right, now let's look at some of the key features of PFM for social protection. The first point I think that needs to be made is that public expenditure on social protection needs to be adequate, equitably distributed, cost efficient, and cost effective. Now, these four things here are high-level public expenditure outcomes. First of all, adequacy. I mean, the question here is enough being spent on social protection or on a specific social protection program? Is the public expenditure on that program adequate? A second question is about equity. Is the expenditure on that social protection program equitably distributed? Is it benefiting more the poorer parts of society, or more the wealthier? If we take, for example, a price subsidy for fuel, it may be presented as being a form of social protection. But since it's the richer people who generally, in developing countries, who have larger houses to heat and are more likely to have cars, then a fuel subsidy, whether it's on electricity or on fuel for cars, is likely to be captured more by the wealthier in society. And we might well, therefore conclude that although this is a sort of social protection in a way, it kind of benefits more the wealthier. And so public expenditure on a subsidy like that is not really very equitably distributed. So the equity of the public expenditure is also very important, in addition to the adequacy. Cost efficiency, this is really to do with how well a social protection program is being managed, and the sort of relationship between the administrative costs and the program and the transfers or whatever that are being distributed to beneficiaries. And we'll come to that at the end of this presentation, because we're going to focus there specifically on the question of cost efficiency. Cost effectiveness is at a higher level. It's really to do with the relationship between the expenditure on a social protection program and the social impacts that program has. And we'll come to that in the session that we're going to do in 2 weeks' time. Let's move on. In order for social protection expenditure to be adequate, equitable, cost efficient, and cost effective, we need three big things, really. First of all, we need appropriate budget policy decisions. You know, there are policy options in social protection, just as there are in any other field. And in order to meet those high-level expenditure outcomes, we need the budget policy decisions to be appropriate. Secondly, there has to be sufficient fiscal space. I mean, the government has to be able, you know, to have the resources available to implement a program. But we'll see that there's a relationship between the sufficient fiscal space and the appropriate budget policy decisions, because fiscal space is not just a technical thing about how much money there is. It's also about how that money is going to be allocated and used. And so the appropriate budget policy decisions affect, in a way, the utilization and even the creation of the fiscal space. Finally, we need a well-functioning PFM system. You know, you could have wonderful policy decisions. There could be even, you know, quite a bit of fiscal space. But if the public financial management system itself doesn't work very well, then that may create problems, particularly perhaps at the stage of executing the budget. So we're going to look a little bit further at these different aspects. Thank you, Aristide. So first of all, fiscal space and policy choices. The adequacy of spending is really to do with affordability, which is a question both of fiscal space and of policy choices, as I've said. And therefore, it's about not just the sort of total amount of resources that are available, but it's also about the decisions that are made about priorities. And those policy choices reflect really politics. I mean, there are political interests involved here. So we need to look at, you know, fiscal space and the politics together. When we're looking specifically, you know, at the fiscal space, graphically, this can be presented as what is called often a fiscal diamond. It's a diamond with four corners that shows where fiscal space comes from. I think it's probably easiest to think of this in terms of additional fiscal space. If we're looking at the question of how to increase spending on a social protection program, or whether we can afford to introduce a completely new social protection program, where would the additional resources for this come from? And basically, there are four potential sources. The one at the top there, which is often the main one, is increased revenue, increased public revenue. And that can come from two things. It can come just from GDP growth. You know, the more that the economy is growing, assuming that the revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product remains unchanged, then just the growth of the economy will generate more public resources, which could be used, depending on policy choices, partly for funding social protection. The second source, which you know, is much smaller, really, is increased grant aid, you know, from donors. Historically, generally, we can say that grant aid has been declining, and in the vast majority of countries, grants from donors are a tiny proportion of the resources that come from domestic revenue. In the middle-income countries, we're talking about, you know, much less than 1% of GDP, whereas domestic revenue can be, I mean, depending on the country, can be like in the range, in most developing countries, in the range from about 15 to 25% of GDP. Obviously, it's more in the low-income countries. The third source, potentially, is increased borrowing, which leads to greater debt. And, you know, with countries facing the risk of debt unsustainability or debt distress, clearly a heavy reliance on borrowing, particularly for recurrent programs like social protection, is not really, in most cases, a favored form of financing. Moving on to the fourth and final corner of the fiscal diamond, we have the reprioritization and increased efficiency of expenditure. And by that I mean that, you know, a program that is inefficient, you know, could simply be suppressed. I mean, I'll give an example. In some countries, there may be arguments to remove an inefficient and inequitable fuel subsidy and to channel part of the resources to a more efficient and more equitable social transfer program. So that would be an example where you could increase the efficiency of expenditure. So those are really the four corners of the fiscal diamond. They are theoretically, if you like, the four potential sources of additional fiscal space to fund an increase in social protection expenditure. Let's move on. Let's move on now to the other dimension that we were looking at, which is the PFM system itself. And as I said, another prerequisite, in addition to appropriate policy choices and fiscal space, is that we have a well-functioning public financial management system. Well, this system operates through the budget cycle, and the graphic there shows you in very broad terms what a budget cycle looks like. It begins at the top right-hand corner, from policy and strategic planning through to budget formulation, you know, in the sense that the budget should be, in theory, this is like a kind of normative budget cycle. The budget formulation should be reflecting the government's policies and its strategic planning. The budget formulation leads on to the approval of the budget, you know, by the Parliament, and then to execution of the budget. The expenditures are made. Moving further around this cycle, you come to the stage of accounting for the expenditures that are made in the public accounts, and monitoring, you know, the expenditure and the quality of the expenditure and the results that are achieved. And then finally, at the end, you have the stage of the audit and evaluation. I mean, the audit can be done both by internal audit bodies within the government, and then by external auditors, and usually then the audit, you know, the report, the audit report from the external auditors goes to the Parliament for final approval, and then the circle continues, you know, from year to year. Now, the point here is that really all of these stages of the budget cycle matter for the adequacy and quality of social protection expenditure. You know, you need to have good plans that then feed into into an appropriate budget, and then the budget needs to be executed properly. Okay, let's move on, and we're going to look at these different stages now a little bit more concretely. So the first stage really is or the first two, three stages are about that transition from policy to budget formulation. The point here for social protection is that it's critical to reflect national social protection policies and strategies in government budgets. And there's often a problem here because often there is a disconnect. And this isn't, unique to social protection. You see the same thing in other sectors like education and health. And I've just selected, one example from an African country here, Mozambique. I personally was just involved in the midterm evaluation of the implementation of Mozambique's second national basic social security strategy, the ENSSB2, which is being implemented over the period from 2016 to 2024. And one thing we looked at is to what extent was the expenditure set out in this strategic plan. To what extent was this expenditure actually implemented in practice by the government? The data here is presented in percentage of GDP because it's sort of easier to compare rather than with big, absolute numbers in national currency. The first thing you can see here is that the annual budget allocations didn't reflect what was in the social security strategy. And by the way, when they say social security here in Mozambique, basic social security, they mean this is actually a strategy for non-contributory social protection. Okay, so what we can see here is that in 2016, even the first year of the strategy, whereas the strategy had projected 0.7% of GDP, the annual budget allocation was actually only 0.4% of GDP. And this, this divergence or disconnect between the strategy and the budget allocations continued all the way through to 2019. So there is the first sort of big problem is how to ensure the coherence between the budget allocations and the approved government policies and strategies. Move on, Aristide. I'm going to now talk about two different ways in which governments try to bridge that those stages from policy and plans to annual budgets. The first is the medium-term expenditure framework. The medium-term expenditure framework, which is normally for 3 years, sometimes for 5, is a sort of strategic budget planning tool. It's easier to phase in changes in expenditure. I mean, especially when they're significant changes over several years, rather than just to do it abruptly from one annual budget to another. So medium-term expenditure frameworks, they make these projections for expenditure over 3 to 5 years. And a very good example of how an MTEF, a good MTEF, can be used to do this comes from the way in which the child support grant was expanded in South Africa. You're probably, many of you, familiar with South Africa's child support grant. It's a grant which began in the late 1990s, initially covering children only up to the age of 7. And then it was gradually expanded so that by 2012, it covered children up to the age of 18. It's a means-tested grant, but it's means-tested in the sense only that it really excludes children from significantly better off households. The vast majority of children in South Africa now receive the child support grant. And you can see there, if you look at the blue line, the increase in the number of beneficiaries of the child support grant during that period of expansion from 2001 to 2012. It went from round about 1 million beneficiaries in 2001 to round about 11 million beneficiaries a decade later in 2012. And that required, as you can imagine, a very substantial increase in expenditure, measured here again as a percentage of GDP. And you can see that on the right-hand side, these orange bars, that the expenditure, was just under 0.2% of GDP at the beginning of that period of expansion in 2001, and it was 1.2% of GDP in 2012 when the expansion to cover children up to the age of 18 was finally achieved. As you can see, it was done in stages. They went from 0 to 7 age range to 0 to 9 to 11 years old, 14 years old, went in steps like this. And this was all planned through the medium-term expenditure framework. I mean, it was consciously plotted out in terms of the fiscal capacity of the state, and so this was phased in a staggered way to bring about this huge expansion in coverage. So this is an example of an instrument that can be used in the public financial management system, where when the MTEF works well, it can be done to do this kind of thing. Moving on to the second example, which is program-based budgeting. Program-based budgeting can also help to strengthen the policy plan budget continuum by linking resources to results. The introduction of PBB goes beyond the traditional practice of allocating resources to government units without any link to the results to be achieved. Because in the old days, as it were, in all countries, budgets were simply given to administrative units of the government, and based on so much for salaries, so much for goods and services, so much for capital equipment, etc. And there was never any link there to the results to be achieved. But with the introduction of program-based budgeting and other similar forms of results-based budgeting, there is a conscious attempt now to link the resources that are being allocated to the results to be achieved. And that can be a way to make sure that there is a much better linkage between the budget allocations and the objectives of government policies and strategies, including in social protection. You can see that chain in the graphic at the bottom. We can move on. Yeah, just very quickly on budget classification, because I think it's probably a good thing for everybody to be aware of. There are sort of 4 types of budget classification. The program classification, which is part of program-based budgeting. But as I said, the sort of traditional form of budgeting uses the economic classification. It simply classifies spending by economic categories such as personnel, in other words, salaries, goods and services, transfers, and capital spending. The administrative classification, which was the other classification, traditionally used and still used, of course, classifies spending by the administrative units, the ministries and departments. So a traditional budget would normally combine those 2 classifications. It would just give so much money to the Ministry of Social Affairs and say that the Ministry of Social Affairs had so much for personnel salaries, so much for goods and services, So much for transfers, which would be, say, for social transfers provided to households and individuals, and so much for buying, purchasing capital equipment and so on, or for infrastructure. The third type of classification, which has also existed for a long time, is the functional classification, which is based on the UN classification of the functions of government, or COFOG, and it has a small number of major functions of government. Social protection is one of them, and it has a number of different sub-functions within each function. Very often in the past, this has just been a kind of amalgam of different administrative categories, from the administrative classification. The program classification has been introduced as part of program-based budgeting and classifies spending by programs and sub-programs, and is associated with not just allocations, but with results to be achieved, and often gives program managers some flexibility to move money around in order to achieve results as best as possible. Next slide. Right, social protection spending. I just want to say something about how it can be classified in budgets as per IMF guidelines, using the economic classification and the functional classification. It's not so easy to do this for the program classification, because that really depends on the definition of the programs in each country. But for the economic classification, transfers is one of the main headings. As you saw, have headings for personnel, which includes salaries and other benefits, and goods and services, transfers, and capital expenditure. Well, transfers is one of the main headings. Transfers include various different things in the economic classification. There are all kinds of transfers from government to other public entities. They could be transfers to state-owned enterprises. They could even be transfers to bail out private firms. But they also include transfers to households and individuals. And that's where social protection comes in the economic classification. They're called their social benefits, and they're all types of transfers to households and individuals, and therefore include a large part of social protection. But bear in mind that this would exclude some things. It would exclude social welfare services, for example, which are not transfers to individuals and households, but rather services. And pension contributions to government employee pension schemes are not included here. They're considered part of personnel remuneration, and so fall under personnel. If we switch to the functional classification, social protection is one of the big functions of government, according to COFOG. It's very broad. It includes not only all the social transfers, but also social welfare services. And it also includes, by the way, emergency assistance following disasters. But it may exclude some expenditure with a social protection character where it's classified under other functions such as health, education, and agriculture. It doesn't allow for any double counting, because this is a form of accounting in an accountancy sense. So you can't double count something under two different functions. I just mentioned this so that you're a little bit familiar with how social protection is accounted for in government accounts. Moving on. Last point, I think in this section of the presentation is really about the challenges of the transition from budget approved budgets to execution of expenditure. Because there is a challenge in ensuring effective execution of expenditure. As it's set out there, if there were delays in the release of funds, that could lead to delays in transfer payments to beneficiaries, and that would lead to a reduced social impact. And this is, can often be a problem, that approved budgets are not implemented or executed as they had been passed by Parliament. I mean, give an example here from Ghana. The LEAP cash transfer program. LEAP means livelihood empowerment against poverty. I think that's what it means, LEAP. I'm trying to remember. It's a cash transfer program to poor households in Ghana. You can see here the budget execution, contrasting the approved budget of 383 million cedis, the national currency, to only 168 million cedis. In other words, the actual execution was only about 50% or less than 50%. And what were the results of that? The results of that were there were huge delays in the payment of the cash transfers to these very poor beneficiary households. And you can imagine the difficulties that would create for those households, and therefore the significant reduction in the social impact of that social transfer program. Okay, let's move on to the next part. I'm sorry this is taking a little bit longer than I was expecting. We have one more part of the presentation about costing and cost efficiency before we move on to the exercise. All right, let's move on. First of all, just in terms of, of the presentation of the costing of social transfers, the total cost of a social transfer program is C is the total program cost. Okay, and it has two different components: the cost of the transfers, T, and the administrative costs of managing and delivering that program, A. So the total cost is C equals T plus A. Now, just to say something about the cost of the transfers, and I think you, in an earlier module, you had a presentation of an Ilo Costing Tool, and what that costing tool would have been doing is making the calculations for you along these lines here. The cost of the transfers, I said, is T equals little t b, where little t is the transfer amount, how much the beneficiary or beneficiary household is paid, say, per month, and B is the number of beneficiaries. Well, the transfer amount, little t, should be determined by considerations of adequacy for the achievement of program objectives, as well as fiscal affordability. And if you were doing, simulations of options for a future program or changes in a program, you would be playing with this transfer amount to try to balance adequacy and affordability. The second part of this is the number of beneficiaries, and that's determined by the eligibility criteria and by the population size and composition. And how the eligibility criteria determine what parts of the population we're talking about here and their size. And that could be by age groups, if it's an old age pension or a child grant, or by disability, if it's a disability benefit, by poverty status, if it's a poverty targeted social protection program, by geographic areas, if it was being introduced in certain parts of a country or being phased in certain parts of a country. And a final thing that you would need to be taking into account if you were simulating this is also exclusion and inclusion errors. If you could have very clear eligibility criteria, but there might well be problems in the targeting that would lead to some of the eligible people not being included. That would be an exclusion error, or including people who are not really eligible, and that would be an inclusion error. Future costs can be simulated under different sets of assumptions about each of the above. So that is how you would be doing the costing of the transfers themselves. On the next slide, we're just going to look very quickly at the administrative costs. These are the salaries, the goods, and next slide. Yeah, the salaries, the goods and services, capital expenditure that are needed to manage and deliver the program. And it's perhaps helpful to subdivide these into the four following elements, because the cost structure can evolve in the course of a program. The first are the fixed setup costs, the studies, the planning, the systems, the information management system, the equipment, the infrastructure that's needed to set up a new program. This would be for a new program, okay? Then the rollout costs, the publicity, the initial targeting and enrollment. This is, again, for a new program. And then the long-term operational costs, the ongoing targeting and enrollment, the payments, the making of the payments, the accompanying measures, if there are any. There could be some communication elements. In some programs, there's conditionality, case management, monitoring, and so on. And then we can also include the evaluation costs, which would tend to be lumpy, maybe every few years. Move on. So finally, we're going to be ending almost in a few minutes about cost efficiency. Cost efficiency is the relationship between costs and outputs. And here, the outputs are the social transfers received by the beneficiaries. So the cost efficiency of social transfers is often measured by what is called the cost transfer ratio, or CTR, which is the ratio of the admin costs to the value of the social transfers delivered. That's our T, okay? So it's the ratio of A to T. The CTR in a mature social transfer program implemented at scale should probably not exceed about 10%, given international experience. Although the CTR will vary according to context and program features. So this is not a fixed rule. It may cost a lot more to implement a certain kind of social transfer, for example, to people with disabilities, or in rural areas compared to urban areas, and so on. So we need to look at this, quite carefully and contextually. These are some of the factors that affect the CTR. Okay, the degree of maturity of a program. In a new program, setup and rollout costs are high, while the number of beneficiaries, and thus the value of transfers, is low. The scale of a program is crucial. The unit administrative costs will fall as programs expand, just due to economies of scale. Program characteristics. Administrative costs will be higher in programs with complex targeting procedures or add-on features such as conditionality. Operating conditions may raise administrative costs, e.g. in rural areas, or when transfer payments have to be made manually by traveling payment teams, which is the case in some particularly poor low-income countries, rather than through, say, banks and post offices, agents, such as businesses, shops, or mobile money accounts. It just may not be possible in some rural areas where network coverage is low, where there are no banks, where there are no post offices. It may be unavoidable to continue using expensive delivery methods for making payments, and that will inevitably raise the cost transfer ratio. Another factor is actually the transfer amount itself. The higher the transfer amount, the higher the value of transfers, which is the CTR denominator, and thus the lower the CTR. Okay, let's move on. Just a couple of examples, and then we'll finish and move on to the exercise. This is an example of how the cost structure changed in Kenya's cash transfer for orphans and vulnerable children, the CTOVC program. In the early years of a social transfer program, set up and rollout costs start off big and then decline while long-term operational costs rise. So you can see that here in Kenya, the ratio of administrative costs to transfer costs declined from 167% in year 2 to 34% in year 3. And I presume it probably declined, further in the subsequent years. Also an example from Mexico's Progresa, a very large cash transfer program in Latin America. You can see there in the graphic, there was a rapid reduction of the CTR from 134% in year 1 to only 5% in year 4, due to the reduction of setup and rollout costs, which, were really a very substantial part of administrative costs at the beginning, and due to the rapid expansion of the program, which had 2.6 million households by year 4, so large economies of scale. Okay, so the key takeaways are that budgets, and thus public financial management, matter a lot for social protection, as much of social protection is financed from public resources, taxation and aid. Public expenditure on social protection needs to be adequate, equitable, efficient, and effective. The adequacy of spending depends both on fiscal space and policy choices, and ultimately politics. How the PFM system functions at each stage of the budget cycles matters also, including for efficiency. And we've seen that both in the transition from policy and plans to budget formulation and from approved budgets to budget execution. With respect to the reflecting of social protection policy and strategy and budget allocations, a good medium-term expenditure framework and program-based budgeting can help, although both of these are themselves very complicated and often don't work very well. At the execution stage, delays in the release of funds can severely affect programs and their impacts. Costing needs to reflect both transfers and the administrative costs of programs, and cost efficiency is a key indicator of performance, but varies according to the context, nature, maturity, and scale of programs. Thank you very much. This is the end of the presentation. I don't know if we should have some questions and discussion now before we move on to the exercise.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I think we can't wait for the more in-depth, the larger course. This was introductory, and would be happy to have the next model as well as the bigger course if it happens. But let's keep some time, maybe 5 minutes or so for question and answers. I've seen lots of comments in the chat box, and I've seen a raised hand as well. So I'm trying to see who raises it. It's Celine. So maybe I will give the floor to Celine while I just put on the screen the instruction for the exercise. Hi, Celine.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Aristide. And thank you very much, Mr. Hodge, for this very, very interesting presentation. A lot of information. I wish we could have more time to go maybe more in details in some of the aspects you mentioned. But listening to you, I have 3 questions or comments, maybe if you allow me. The first one is, I thought that when I thought that in the definition of social protection expenditure, social protection budget, both revenues expenditure, I thought we were also including the social insurance contribution and then the social insurance benefits paid through this budget. And I had the impression that was also the classification or the definition that the IMF has adopted to include social insurance, not only the contribution for the government employee that you mentioned, and not only the subsidies that you mentioned in the case of social health insurance, but also the social insurance institution paying pension, working injury benefits. I thought that their revenues and expenditure were part of the definition of social protection budget in the classification. So if you could just help me to understand how it articulates, whether it's a question that we're looking at the central budget or the national budget, if there's a definition, a distinction between the two. My second observation is when we talk about fiscal space, I think it's also important to look at how to create fiscal space and not only try to expand social protection, because we're all pursuing the objective of achieving universal social protection. So how do we also support the governments to expand their fiscal space and not only to work on the existing fiscal space now available, but also coming with policy coordination, policy work, based analytical work to expand this fiscal space. And so here is also linked to my third observation, adequacy. No, adequacy, I think we can have different meaning. The IMF in their social spending floor, they talk about adequacy towards the efficiency in the budget, the affordability, as you have mentioned. In the social protection floor, the UN, maybe if we can say social protection floor, adequacy really relates to the adequate level of benefits. And working on social protection policy, horizontal coverage, covering as many people as possible within the financing possibilities. This is one aspect, but also looking at ensuring that the level of benefit that are provided through the social protection program are adequate. And in the social protection floor concept definition, and also in light of the presentation we had last week with the principles of social protection, this international principle of social protection, adequacy refers to having adequate social protection. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tony, I don't know if we should maybe take all the questions and then you just answer if they overlap or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's best.
So maybe happy to see Shara's hand raised. So Shara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aristide. I'm just looking for my camera. There we go. Thank you very much, Tony, for this very clear presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you. I just have one question, which is about this whole issue of efficiency of expenditure. And the point about, that whether there, you gave the example of certain subsidies that may be captured more by sort of higher income groups as opposed to lower incomes. I mean, energy subsidies was the example you used. And if there is the possibility of, reducing such expenditures and shifting budgets, let's say allocating a bigger budget to, let's say, a transfer, which is targeted to lower income households. So my question is really how to get around this dilemma that we have within social protection, that we know when certain expenditures are targeted to very low income households, they often become, very easy to get rid of politically because you don't get the beneficiaries being also slightly higher income households who would benefit from this, and therefore there would be a greater political traction for sustaining these systems, you know. And I think the example of Progressa that you gave is a very good example, because it was a program that was very targeted to low-income households, and, you know, politically it was expendable and it was cut in Mexico. So I think there is an issue around how to create the broader coalitions, cross-class coalitions sometimes, that can sustain the longer-term you know, can ensure the longer term sustainability of certain social protection benefits, rather than just targeting them to the poorest and, you know, the lowest income households. And it also kind of works in a way, if we see social expenditure, more broadly speaking, as creating a system. I think that argument was made in the 1980s by the World Bank for cutting expenditure on tertiary education and secondary education, saying these are captured by higher income households. But then it ignored the fact that, you know, you need tertiary education to train the teachers that are even needed for primary education. So it completely ignored the way in which this works as a system. So that's really kind of, I think, the question I want to put forward to you, and would be really interested to hear your reactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shara. And we have one last hand, which is Bob. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Aristide, and nice to see Tony and colleagues. I have two questions, maybe a comment and a question. Let me start with the question. On the principle of adequacy, Tony, should we also not be talking about sustainability? And I'm raising this because if you analyze spending patterns in a number of countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, for example, social protection expenditures, which is non-contributory, is very volatile. For instance, in the past year, a couple of governments increased the spending on social protection. Already they are cutting back. So we have these increases, they're cutting back, and, you know, a program is introduced and then again it's cut. So to what extent should we also be saying to governments, look, we may have benefited from grants, concessional loans, or maybe, you know, a good season. But what is most important is to ensure sustainability of social protection spending. So this is the first point. The second point, I followed the discussion on fiscal space, but I feel there is one point we may need to emphasize, is that strictly speaking, there is no like fiscal space for social protection in its, I mean, in a technical way, because when governments have additional budget room, the fiscal space for social protection is subject to past trends in allocations, is subject to political choices. And I'm raising this because I did a smaller exercise just to look at the elasticity of social protection spending in relation to other sectors. So you will notice when revenues change, social protection spending increases at a slightly lower rate compared to education and health, for instance, right? So meaning even if there is fiscal space, there's real competition for resources. And I think we still need to highlight then the political economy aspects of resource allocation or utilization of the fiscal space. I thought I would just mention that and be happy to hear your thoughts on that. Back to you.
Thank you, Bob. And I've seen Pierre from Senegal.
Yes, thank you, Aristide, and thank you. I have a question about how to monitor the social protection expenditure, given the fact that the social protection is a cross-sectoral. I mean, we can include health expenditure, education expenditure that is related to the social protection. When we want to monitor or to capture the social protection expenditure, how to manage it? What's the type of classification? I mean, the IMF classification. What the type of classification is the best to monitor or to capture the social protection expenditure? Thank you.
Thanks, and Tony, the floor is yours. So, and then we will jump to the exercise, to the group work.
Yeah, it's a pity that there really isn't a lot of time to cover everything. Well, first, Celine, I think actually what you've done is you've, on the first point you made, is you've pinpointed the difference between central government expenditure and general government expenditure. Yes, if you are, I was really talking about central government expenditure. But if you were looking at general government expenditure, including social security funds as part of general government, then you would be including absolutely everything. Yes, because they are paying out, those funds are paying out benefits on contributory schemes as well. But I was trying to highlight the specifically the central government expenditure. But I was still making the point that the vast majority of social protection expenditure is there at the central government level, but it will be more if you include also the funds as part of general government expenditure. The second point about how to create fiscal space, I mean, it depends on the country context, but in many countries, it's I think, I mean, over time, it's by increasing domestic revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product. I mean, if you're in South Asian countries, for example, where a very low proportion of GDP is mobilized as government revenue for all sorts of historic political economy reasons, then I think one would argue that probably the best way to expand fiscal space in those countries for social protection and other things would be by improving the level of domestic revenue as a percentage of GDP. In other countries, though, I mean, well, in many countries, though, it can also be by the efficiency gains that we've been talking about, by shifting expenditure from inefficient programs to more efficient programs. And I think the subsidy versus social transfer example is a very good case. But we're going to come, and that raises also the points that were made by Shara. How do I pronounce your name? Shara Shub. I hope I'm getting it roughly right. But before we get there, though, just quickly on the adequacy question. Yeah, I'm sorry if there's a bit of an ambiguity there. We're talking about adequacy of two different things here. The first thing is adequacy of benefits, yes. And I said that when you're looking at the level of transfers, you should be, in addition to affordability, you should be looking above all at the adequacy of benefits in order to ensure that the programs achieve their social objectives. But when we use adequacy in the context of public expenditure, what we are talking about is the adequacy of the level of public expenditure on a program. That's the adequacy of the whole program. And that includes even its administrative costs. There has to be adequate expenditure both on administration and on the transfers themselves for the program to be managed and to be delivered and to achieve its social objectives. So one thing is the adequacy of the benefits specifically. A broader concept is the adequacy of the public expenditure on the program. I mean, I hope that distinction is clear and is not leading to confusion. Returning to Shara Shub's points, I mean, at this stage, given the lack of time, all I can say is that I agree fully with everything that you said, and I would suggest strongly that we leave that actually until the session in 2 weeks' time. Because there we're going to be looking actually at the case that we're going to be looking at specifically is the case of Tunisia and the trade-off between a universal child grant and fuel and food subsidies. This is not be looking at so much the trade-off with a very narrowly poverty-focused cash transfer program, but with a much wider social transfer program, that would actually, as you say, be politically and socially more meaningful and more acceptable in a country facing enormous economic and social difficulties, where those middle class deciles, if you like, are also suffering from the economic difficulties in Tunisia, and would suffer from the removal of the food and fuel subsidies. Even if the fuel subsidies are tilted more to the rich, the middle and the lower deciles also do benefit from them. And I think the political economy point there is really similar to what you said, that a program needs to be broad enough to address the broader social problem and to be politically acceptable, in addition to being more cost effective and more equitable. But I think the Tunisia example will be a very nice illustration of that in 2 weeks' time. Bob's point, I mean, I think that given the time, I can just agree. Yes, you have to look at sustainability and not just adequacy in a short-term sense. I suppose sustainability is the sort of intertemporal dimension of adequacy. We have to be able to sustain adequate spending over time, and you're absolutely right. In the post-COVID context, with risks of need for fiscal consolidation to reduce very large or widened fiscal deficits and higher debt burdens coming out of the COVID crisis, there is a risk that some of these social protection measures and programs that were either introduced or were expanded during the COVID crisis may be scaled back. So yes, the sustainability issue is really crucial. And I agree with you that the question of the competition for resources, and thus the political economy of the decision making about where priorities lie, that's also absolutely crucial to take into account. Pierre's last sort of final point, how to monitor social protection expenditure. I think if I understood the question, I think it was concerned about the multi-sectoral dimension of social protection. I think and he was asking what classification should he use, but I think maybe if we're talking about, say, a national social protection strategy or strategic plan, then I think probably it's better to tailor it to the needs of the strategy itself. You know, if it's a national social protection strategy that is multi-sectoral and includes things in not just a social affairs ministry or a labor ministry, but also in agriculture or education or health, then you know the strategy will reflect those different dimensions of social protection, and the budget for that strategy will obviously therefore have to reflect those different components of the strategy, and the monitoring of a strategy should then be as broad as the composition of the strategy itself. I think we probably better end there. I'm getting very worried about the time now for the exercise. Are we allowed to stretch the session, or is that not allowed?
Yeah, sorry, my mic was muted. So yeah, thanks very much, Tony. And I really think maybe it's good to have a different session after this training on the unanswered questions, all the additional questions people would have, because I've seen in other sessions as well that people are having lots of questions that they would like to be asking. So let's see how we can organize this. And for the group work, I see we don't have much time. So maybe what we can do, and let me know, Tony and Alvaro, if this is good, it's maybe not going into group works, right? And then giving some time to people to read the case, and then we come into plenary and then we discuss. What do you think, Tony?
Well, that's an alternative, given the short amount of time.
Yeah. So let's do that. So shall we just go through, you just explain what we're going to do, and then we give like 10 minutes or 15 minutes to people, then we come back into plenary.
I'll be very quick on what we're going to do then. Yeah, okay. So first slide.
Doesn't want to move. Yeah, that's good.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, it's an exercise based on the budget data for a mythical Asian country, the Republic of Bandala, in the context of COVID. I since discovered that Bandala is apparently a valley in Kashmir, but it's got nothing to do with that. So please read the Word document. It's just one page of text, and then there's a set of data tables. But as you say, as Aristide just said, we'll then go straight into the plenary to answer the questions. So does everybody have the Word document? The 4 questions are, I don't think there's much point me reading them out, but there's one about, whether or not social protection expenditure increased, one about where the fiscal space came from, another about the converting of social protection expenditure allocations into actual spending, and a final one about cost efficiency.
So thank you, Tony. So maybe we go, we take time to read the document. We get back in the plenary at 8:30. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll send everyone to the room and then bring people back to the plenary in 12 minutes. Okay, see you later.
No, we don't have group works. So we stop doing, we won't do the breakout rooms. We'll just let people go themselves and then have a look at the Word document, and then we just resolve the questions together in a plenary.
Oh, okay. So I'll cancel the group then.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alvaro. So I will leave the questions on the screen, and then we get back together in 15 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, 10 minutes, that should be enough to look at it, I think.
Yeah, I said 8. Yeah, let's say 8:30. We get back together at 8:30. Thank you.
All right, okay. Very good.
So welcome back everybody to the session. So let's give back the floor to Tony to lead us throughout the discussion. So maybe we have discussions on the question and then we go to the response.
Yeah, so well, it's just take question one then. Did social protection expenditure increase in 2020 after the outbreak of COVID? Does everybody have access to the questions separately, or are they relying on this slide to be able to see them?
They mainly rely on the slide, and I've pasted the questions in the chat box.
Oh, they're in the chat box. Okay, good. All right, so who would like to start off on question one? Somebody who's not spoken, if possible. Nobody's ready yet.
Is everybody back, by the way? I'm not sure. Oh, Bob is there. Great.
Yeah, I'm around. I wanted to tackle question number 1.
Okay.
Whether social protection expenditure increased after the COVID pandemic. My response is yes. And I based my response on table 1, which shows the government expenditure on social protection from 2018 to 2020. And here I'm analyzing like expenditure under Minister of Social Affairs, which in 2018 it was the actuals. It was 1.42 of the GDP, and then in 2020 it was 1.77% of the GDP. And I said yes, it increased after the pandemic.
That's just the Ministry of Social Affairs, right?
Yes, that's where I thought I can take my response from, because they are the one responsible. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. But you could have taken the total at the bottom of the table, because the table is called Government Expenditure on Social Protection, and it's sort of multi-sectoral.
Yeah, very right, which is from 5.43 to 5.98% of the GDP from 2018 to 2022.
Right.
2020.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple question, this. I don't think we need to dwell on it much longer. Let's just move on. I mean, there are various points additional points that you can make here. That expenditure on the Needy Families Support Program increased the most in 2020, although the actual increase was less than planned in the revised budget. Expenditure was much higher than in 2019 due to the horizontal and vertical expansion. There was also a significant increase in the expenditure on input subsidies for smallholder farmers. As a percentage of GDP, some programs showed a small increase in expenditure due to the fall in GDP, the denominator. That's just sort of like an accounting point almost. But expenditure did decline substantially for some programs affected by the pandemic, by the restrictions, public works and school feeding. Okay, let's just move on straight on to question number 2. I think we have to move back, Aristide, to see the question. Can you move back? Yeah, there we are. So where did the fiscal space for expanding social protection expenditure during the COVID crisis come from? Pietro, would you like to answer that?
I mean, easily from the text, from referring to the Fiscal Diamond, we see that there has been an increase in aid, and then also that the government increased borrowing from both external and domestic lenders, and the fact that they had a fairly low debt to GDP ratio allowed them to scale up the expenditure in response to COVID.
Yeah. Absolutely. Any more observations about this? I mean, what we do know is that the fiscal space, contracted in terms of domestic revenue because the revenue dropped by 1.63% of GDP. But that was more than offset by this increase in grant aid and especially by the increased borrowing. We don't know really what happened. I mean, we don't have the information here to know really what happened in terms of reprioritization and increased efficiency of expenditure. But what we do know is that the social protection expenditure increased by 0.51% of GDP. That's from 2019 to 2020. And that really was only 15% of the expanded fiscal space from borrowing and if you just take revenue, grants and borrowing together, you had 3.45% of GDP. So the expanded social protection expenditure only took up 15% of that additional fiscal space. Everybody happy with that, or any queries or other observations? But I think this sort of shows you how you can do a kind of fiscal space analysis. You look at these different corners of the fiscal diamond and see how much additional fiscal space is being generated or is being lost in the case of domestic revenue there, and see, to what extent, how the government was in this case able to increase its social protection expenditure by a relatively small proportion of that additional fiscal space that came mainly from borrowing. I mean, that then does pose Bob's sustainability question, I think. What will then happen in the subsequent years if this government is then going to try to reduce its fiscal deficit? Let's move on to question 3. If we go back, Aristide, 2 slides, yeah. How well did Bandala convert its social protection expenditure allocations in the revised 2020 budget into actual spending? What was the overall budget execution rate for social protection, and what were the main problems? Who would like to contribute on that? Marcelo?
Hi, so from my interpretation, well, we can see in table, we can see in table 2 the budget execution rate. So the actual budget execution rate is lower in 2020 than it was in 2018 and 2019. So it goes from 92.3 to 93.7, goes all the way down to 90.2. And I think the reason why that happened, well, they mentioned in the text that they were targeting the NFSP, right? So the Needy Family Support Program, and they try to do it vertically. So they had to identify hundreds of thousands of people, of new households, of people who actually needed the support, right? And then because of the difficulties of doing that during COVID times, they ended up falling shorter than their expected levels of spending. So I think in that case, it's more to do with the technical difficulties. It's more to do with the technical difficulties of implementing a program during a pandemic.
Right. Yeah, and then the execution rate for that program was only 76.6% for those reasons. You can also add problems with a couple of other programs, right? That also would have dragged down the overall execution rate. Does anybody want to mention those? Well, quickly there, the school feeding program, because the schools were closed, had an execution rate of only 40.2%, and the public works was suspended. And so the public works had a very low execution rate of 57.3% as well. Right. Okay, moving on to the last question, question 4. Calculate the CTR, ratio of administrative cost to value of transfers, for the largest 2 social transfer programs, the Social Old Age Pension and the Needy Family Support Program in 2020. Which program was the more cost efficient, and why might this be? Chandranshu?
Yeah, I can come in. Thank you.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so if you go to table 3, it actually gives the value of CTR there, 4.6 and 23.8%, 23.5.
Yes.
So in my view, the basic old age pension is more cost efficient because the value of CTR is 4.6% of the transfers.
Yeah.
So this is the reason why I would say that old age pension was more cost efficient. And maybe the reason why this might be this is so, it might be because for social old age pension the systems were already in place when it comes to disbursement of old age pensions, and probably if I have read well, old age pension is for everyone above 65. So this is the reason why I feel old age pension thing is more efficient.
Right. maybe we can just go, Aristide, to that last slide then with the response to this one. What has just been pointed out, the CTR for NFSP is 23.5%, and the other one is 4.6%. So it's quite clear the basic old age pension is more cost efficient than the NFSP. I mean, possibly we don't know what the explanations are, though. This is speculation. I mean, one reason might just simply be that the transfer amount might be higher in the case of the pension. Possibly that could be an explanation. And then the administrative costs for the NFSP might be higher due to more complex targeting and enrollment procedures. You know, the pension might require simply providing a document with age, and there's automatic enrollment on demand. In the case of the NFSP, which was a poverty-targeted program, it's probably a much more complicated targeting and enrollment process, and we've seen that already created delays and the low budget execution rate for that program. So that might be another explanation. With that, I think we've gone over our time by about 12 minutes. Thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful. And as I said before, in 2 weeks' time, what we're going to be looking at is equity and cost effectiveness in social protection programs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. Thank you very much, Aristide, for organizing this particular session. And we are certainly looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, November 8th. Thank you very much. Aristide, would you like to close something?
Yeah, just to thank you very much, Alvaro, for taking lead on this course. That was very interesting, and thanks to Tony for leading us through this session. So as Alvaro said, we're looking forward to the next one. But by the meantime, thanks to all the participants, and especially to those who stayed 14 minutes now above time. And next meeting or next discussion will be on Thursday, or on next Wednesday, which will be a very interesting session, and I hope you are all going to attend. Thank you, and have a nice end of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Thanks,
Bye.
Tony.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Malaysia.